At the end of every interview that we have for teacher candidates, we will say, "What questions do you have for us?" And they will always ask, "Well, what kind of support can I expect?" And we will always say, "Well, don't worry, we'll give you a mentor." But it's not real mentorship. I mean, it's support with the difficult kid or the field trip form or the grade card, but it isn't coaching. That's where partners like EdConnective step in. They provide observation and feedback with practice. That's real coaching. Their mission is to ensure that every student thrives by facilitating exceptional educator growth. So whether it's science of reading, whether it's leadership development, whether you're trying to build the best recruitment and retention efforts, check out edconnective.com. Before I start this episode, I want to make sure that you know that this episode deals with trauma. If you have experienced trauma in your past, you might want to find the right time to listen to this episode. And remember, if you or someone you know needs the suicide or crisis lifeline, you can dial 988 from any phone. For me, the experience as my guest, an author and a former Army veteran and trainer, the experiences that he describes in the episode reminded me of leading a school district during the pandemic. I can remember like it was yesterday. The year was turning from 2019 to 2020, and I was a superintendent, and I was starting to hear about a virus appearing in Seattle and New York. And I wrote in my journal that we should really start to plan to give an update on the emerging coronavirus at an April board meeting. But it was mid-March when I had a meeting with the director of the local health department, and it became abundantly clear that presentation would need to be way earlier than April. I would have to explain why the virus would be closing the district down. So in advance of the meeting, I responded to questions from the community. They wanted to know, how is this year different from past years when there were high cases of the flu? And I'd have to say, in all other years, we were not directed to stay home by every level of national, state, and local government. And then in all other years, we were not tuning into the news or talking with neighbors who had been impacted in some way by this global pandemic. And that in all other years, we hadn't felt such traumatic loss. And I can remember hoping for a return to normal routines. Everyone was hoping for that. Unfortunately, like school districts all across the globe, each decision caused more and more grief. And the weeks following that April meeting would be followed by decisions about proms and graduations and summer school and summer professional development. I can tell you that the school board and I, we tried to make decisions about the possibility of returning to buildings to close out the academic year, and how we were so dismayed that that became an impossibility. We turned our attention to the next school year, began making plans for what a return might look like. My guest today, he talks about how to talk with adults who've experienced trauma. And you can tell from my description, I found such comfort talking with him. School leaders, all leaders, we're not often trained to handle our own distress, nor are we necessarily skilled at recognizing the trauma of others. Dan Joseph, my guest, is a terrific guest. And he talks about the things to look for, the things to notice, like people being hypervigilant, for example. It's such a valuable resource. And in the second part, he describes a time when a soldier was working through mental health and lockdowns, and people were struggling with their own traumas and didn't have the bandwidth to help this one individual. The directions were to keep it quiet and stick with the mission. This second part is what happens when a leader is faced with exposing a difficult truth, which would require everyone to face the issues. I mentioned some great articles on self-awareness and other resources, and I'll put links in the show notes. This is such a great episode. I'm Peter Stiepelman, and this is An Imperfect Leader. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dan Joseph is my guest. And this is a pretty serious episode because when I met Dan, it became clear that the leadership work that he does is something that educational leaders must hear. The general public really doesn't know what school and district leaders do. I mean, they have some idea. And I can remember, though, a parent asking me at a school event, like, what I did during my summers off. I was responsible for 19,000 kids, 3,000 employees, a budget exceeding $400 million, and he thought I got the summers off. So beyond the numbers, though, I was responsible for so many people who were experiencing trauma, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, addiction, homelessness, violence, death, and so on. There are these realities of a school and district leader that we face, and we weren't really trained for the kind of trauma fatigue that we experience. So today we get to meet Dan Joseph, an Army veteran and the author of Backpack to Rucksack, Insight into Leadership and Resilience from Military Experts. And you can expect that I will put a link in the show notes. Let me say now, sorry for that long intro, Dan. Thank you and welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Yeah, great to be here and definitely eager to talk about this subject for sure.
Dan, that was obviously a long lead-in, and my apologies. But one of the things that we talk about in leadership is the power of language. And that can look like framing a situation or scenario building. And it also speaks to the use of metaphors. And sometimes teachers and leaders use the metaphor of being on the front line or in the foxhole together. And they use this metaphor of being at war. And I somewhat cringe at that because in education, we really should be considered gardeners or choreographers, or we should be symphony conductors, right? We are tending to something beautiful. And yet when I read parts of your book and reviewed combatpsych.com tools, and I listened to you on the power of our story, I was struck by some of the similarities that we look for when it comes to leadership in the military and in education. And that includes the ability to look back and see what we can learn from our experiences. And the power of language includes storytelling. And would you talk about your book a little bit and the importance of talking about personal trauma?
Yeah, definitely. So I essentially what caused this whole book to come about was after being in the military, I was actually not combat deployed myself. I was in a non-deployable unit training folks to deploy, but I worked with a lot of veterans who, combat veterans, guys who've been to war and gals who've experienced things that, they've had difficulty processing and talking about. And so, working alongside them, I was able to see variations and kind of the manifestations of trauma, of PTSD, one of them told me to call it PTS. They want to drop the D out of it because they don't want to look at it as a disorder, but it's interesting to see the evolution of this. But yeah, I was working with folks who were processing so much in real time while they were also having flashbacks to the past and having to work that out as well. And so it was really apparent to me how important it was that I respect that sort of weight that they carry, even though I wasn't necessarily aware of it or they weren't explicitly disclosing it to me, but I was capable of maybe aggravating it or helping to soothe that if I was aware of it. And I noticed that. And it's just anywhere from vocal tonality, how I spoke to them, words I would say, nonverbal cues have a lot to do with it. Handling the sense of urgency that comes in training and whatnot. It was real apparent that leaders have a direct ability to either make a situation worse or make it better. And so I wanted to study the academics of, the warm, fuzzy feelings of kindness and being considerate of others. Because a lot of these things in the military, it doesn't go discussed. Oftentimes they say, right, we're there to focus on the mission. We're there to focus on tactical parameters, but it is a people business. Everyone in the military, all these folks who are serving, they all have a story. They all have something that brought them in. And if you look at the research, the majority of, comparatively to the civilian population, those who are recruited into the military tend to come from backgrounds with higher ACEs, higher ACE scores. So adverse childhood experiences. And just understanding that it's that much more important to again, tend to the trauma, tend to the anxiety and stress that a lot of them carry that they may not be aware of. And having my own issues allowed me to have context. I've been through therapy and been to counseling for other things. And, they're universal tools, right? Once you learn toolkits to handle psychological issues, every human being can use them.
So tell me a little bit about, for example, some of the training that we get in education, particularly is around understanding and seeing those markers among children. So, a child is withdrawn or a child comes to school where they may be wearing the same clothes or they're hungry or they've wet themselves or they bristle at being touched, even, on a safe touch. And there is there's somewhat of these sort of red flags that we see. And I imagine with adults, there's some similarities and also some differences. And you talked about nonverbals and you talked about tonality. And I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific, particularly because I think some of the leaders who are listening to our program are working more often with adults. And so what are some of the things that you have noticed? And what might be some strategies that you've used to sort of de-escalate situations so that you're opening up that prefrontal cortex so one is able to have a conscious conversation about what's happening as opposed to being stuck in that limbic right state of using their emotions or in that brainstem of just fight or flight. So I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, and this is a brilliant question. This is exciting stuff because the manifestations can be, there's so many varieties to it, right? And essentially to just simplify it, it's, looking for the parasympathetic activation, so we're looking for fight, flight, freeze, fawn, faint. There's so many variations now. And based on somebody's baseline personality, how are they deviating from that, and what triggering event has caused that deviation, and how frequently is it occurring? And there's so many facets here. So in real life, how it looked practically is if somebody would just glaze over, if I could see somebody is dissociated, right, and suddenly because of something that happened. So for being in the Army, a lot of times it had to do with explosions from, say, we're at the demolition range, we detonate some C4 and it explodes because that's what it does. And then somebody that is with us at the range with combat experience would just freeze over, and we would stop moving, stop motion, and just be in this flashback back into time. And one of them, mid conversation, just stopped talking to me. And I'm like, hey, what, you all right? What happened? And I said, sorry, I just, that explosion just reminded me of my losing a friend on our patrol in the Middle East. So things like that would be, super obvious and direct, right? That something happened. So I'd have to step back and give them time to process it. Other times I would see people get extremely angry and aggressive, like over, when somebody overreacts to the environmental stimuli, right? It clearly doesn't match the situation at hand, and yet they're overreacting to it. Well, that's because their brain is on hypervigilance, and they want to survive something that is perceived as being deadly or scary or devastating, especially if it happened during childhood. And their overreaction, if you will, in the present day is their brain not knowing the transience of time. It doesn't know that this was in the past. It deems this threat as a present threat. And so you'd see balled up fists, you would see a clenched jaw, sporadic eye contact, like not a very uneasy direct gaze, if you will.
Right. And so their brain is flooded with either adrenaline or cortisol, and they're so is the one sort of universal approach. I noticed you said something along the lines of giving space and not peppering with questions. Everything okay? What are you talking about? Do you want to talk about it? That only escalates the situation.
Yeah. Oh man, I'd say space is always the best default, holding a comfortable silence, if you will. And there's so much to say to that because again, a lot of it has to do with your nonverbal cues, and so this is where if somebody in your audience has experienced trauma in their past, especially childhood, and they've recovered from it to the point where they're able to manage it and understand it, this is where it becomes a superpower. Because you're able to understand from your own empathy of what made you uncomfortable, what hurt you. And so you can sort of almost subconsciously react in a way where it's like, hey, I'm not scared. I'm not going to run away from you. I'll be here for you if you need it, but it's not smothering. It's not overwhelming, right? There's not enmeshment there. And so oftentimes what I noticed was just giving space, but then also just explicitly stating that if you need somebody, I'm here for you. Basically, nothing you're not alone, and it's not going to scare me. And this is where words don't manifest that trust, right? There has to be a felt understanding that, what you do, you're not compensating, you're not overreaching right now. You are being honest, and that sincerity is visceral, right? Primal feeling when someone's being authentic. It can't be fabricated at just a primal level. There's just such amazing circuitry to our limbic system and our brainstem and all of that. And so when somebody truly feels that about you, then they'll approach you quietly and one-on-one. And yeah, that's something, especially with combat vets, sometimes it has to do with having a scotch together or drinking a beer, which, you got to be careful with because self-medication's a thing. And then also you never want somebody to divulge something about themselves under the influence because then they're going to feel bad about it, right? And then there's the hangover from divulging all of that. So it's important to, how do you relate? You got to read the situation and read the friendship or professional, dynamic, and then go from there. But really what it comes down to is, I believe, love and consideration for our fellow man, as somebody human, and you got to strip away the rank, you got to strip away the uniform and the title and all of that if you truly want to have an eye-to-eye conversation. But that's a very rare thing for us to be able to do because of propriety and all of that. But some people are able to do that in ways that are more efficient, and others don't even want to go there, right? And so, but if it comes down to life and death and you're trying to genuinely keep someone from harming themselves, then man, it's worth it to kind of break propriety at times and make sure that person stays breathing, because it's in the military and in the veteran world, it gets to that point where we literally have to check on each other to make sure guys are still doing all right, the gals are still alive and still around, because it's complex and it's messy, but that's humanity, that's life. And again, I'm not scared of that conversation. You aren't scared. And this is what people need to know, that there are folks like us that do care, and we'll handle the mess within reason.
Yeah.
I could ramble for days.
No, I certainly have lanced something, and it's like, woo, it's really good. In my book and in the leadership model that I use to advise others, and you use the word human, and that's what it is. It's a human-centered model. There's a dimension, it's called nested patterns. And inside that dimension, and nested patterns speaks to the muscle of an organization's work. It's how we behave. It's sort of the way, it's our default. And inside there is a term or terms, empathy and compassion. And your book speaks to the importance of these two traits. It's deeply personal for you because you want to have an impact on the mental health of soldiers, of others. And I wonder, what do you want the public to learn from you and the people that you write about, especially in the area of empathy and compassion?
I like that question because it's actually not about learning anything other than about themselves. That's the whole point of this, is self-reflection, because the healthier we become individually, the healthier our communities become. And that's what I love about, when I worked on my master's in organizational psych, I got to study that, how basically organizations, right? Yeah, they could be sterile and clinical or bureaucratic or what have you. They're comprised of people, though, with beating hearts. And what's neat is, the more we focus on the people, on the individual, the collective benefits, because we're better neighbors and roommates and, partners and friends and all of that. And so it's so important for people, if I'd ask anybody who would read my book, is to think about how you can enrich your life, make yourself healthier, make yourself better. And then that'll just exude love towards others and compassion towards others, because, you'd never want to talk down to somebody if you don't talk down to yourself. But if you have a horrible inner critic and a horrible inner dialogue, that's going to come out in how you speak to others. It's maybe not as loudly, but I truly believe that, when you meet somebody who is kind, they're kind to themselves. It's generated from an internal state. And I would just like to catalyze that, because that's something I have to work on myself, right? So if I want people around me to be healthy, then I need to make sure I'm healthy, so I'm not dragging them down, right? And
that's
human.
Interesting.
We're all
yeah.
human, so we got to work on it. It's not a perfect system.
I recently read an article in the Harvard Business Review. It's actually an older article, but it was I had interviewed about 5,000 people about self-awareness. And the question was, do you consider yourself self-aware? And it was like only 10 to 15% really were self-aware, in the sense that there's an internal self-awareness and external. And the way that I best understand that is to say, internally, we have a system of principles, beliefs, and values. And I think you were kind of speaking to that as like, if one of your values is kindness, are you kind to yourself and kind to others? But it's like, so if those are your values, the external self-awareness is, do people recognize that in you? Do they actually see that as well? Are your values and your actions aligned? Which would then say whether or not you have true self-awareness. And I was like, oh, that makes more sense. Because I could imagine when you ask people, are you self-aware? They're like, of course I am. But it's like, but what do you think about yourself is what do other people think about you as well. So how does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
I mean, it's honest. It's honest, and it's just factually sound. That what leader wouldn't be imperfect, and it brings to mind the varying degrees of imperfection we carry, and not only of imperfection, but of progress that we carry based on our willingness to progress ourselves and to have a growth mindset, right? As Carol Dweck pointed out. And so when I think imperfect leader, I think of it as currently in a point in time, a level of imperfection, but also with the potential for so much growth as long as there is a willingness to face pride and ego and any sort of maladaptive defensive behaviors in order to obtain and manifest and actualize a better version of ourselves. And it's important.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Dan Joseph, an Army veteran and the author of Backpack to Rucksack, Insight into Leadership and Resilience from Military Experts. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they've had to make, and then we discuss it. So Dan, what happened?
So there is a situation with a soldier that I was working alongside who was struggling with mental health issues, and some other folks were aware of it. I was aware of it, but there were a few individuals who believed that they didn't want to invest the time in digging more into the issue because, well, this was during the lockdowns. Everyone was already stressed. It was a global pandemic, and quite frankly, there are individuals who are struggling with their own issues, right? Their own trauma, their own psychological burdens, and they just didn't have the bandwidth to hear about another hurting individual. And so a sentiment was growing about keep people quiet, keep this individual focused on work and just carry on with the mission. And let's all just make it through this. But I was really feeling in my heart and my gut, a visceral kind of red warning light buzzing off on, hey, this is important that we listen to the soldier and that we hear other soldiers as well. We need to allow them to speak, because if we don't, I don't think that it's going to quiet down. I think that the problem is going to grow. But it was a point of contention with some folks who were in the military longer than I was. And they had said, this is how we do things. This is our culture. And I disagreed. And so I was slower to disagree than I should have been looking back, because again, they were struggling. And so I knew what they were saying about keep things quiet. It's because they were keeping things quiet within themselves. And so, it begs the question of how do you go into an organization? And every unit in the military is different. This isn't, ubiquitous of the whole military, but I was in a particular unit where, there were folks who were struggling. And so how much can one person change, and how much can be catalyzed in a conversation when it's going to make everybody have to face issues, right? Once this is brought up, it shakes the entire system. But that keeps people alive. It's worth it. It's just, again, a very messy process.
So if I'm understanding correctly, one, something that all leaders know is that when you agitate for change, the system will work aggressively to return to status quo. And so here you were trying to agitate or nudge a cultural field that existed that said, we don't talk about these issues. And you're talking about a time where all of us nationwide and internationally were struggling with lockdowns, and then exacerbated by those experiences that you and your colleagues have experienced through their service. And that must have been an incredible additional sort of layer of trauma that they were dealing with. And you had a colleague or a peer who was struggling, and you wanted to intervene, and the sort of response was, we don't do that. But it sounds like you did intervene ultimately. And I'm kind of curious. So did I capture that so far?
Yeah.
Somewhat?
Yeah,
okay. And well, so when you look back on this, what do you think got overlooked in this particular situation? Obviously, no names. You've been really careful about that. And I certainly will not pressure you to names or locations, because I think really what we're trying to get at is just as you reflect back on this experience, what happened, and then certainly like what got overlooked.
Looking back, I'm still trying to make sense of this. What happens is oftentimes people will check a box. Did you have this conversation? Yes or no? But the heart of it wasn't necessarily there. And so how, we can quantifiably try to alter something or fix it or address something, but qualitatively, what actually was said, right? And so people will hide behind the quantifiable metrics. Yes and no. This happened. Yes, this happened. No, this happened. Whatever it is. But you got to look at it from a qualitative viewpoint. Did you actually come across with that messaging? Did people respond well to it? Did they feel seen? Did they feel heard and validated? And if not, why not? And usually, from what I understand, is if there were soldiers that were asked certain things to find out, how are you doing? How are things going on, going with your life, and what issues are you having that we need to know about that we can help you with? If they did feel invisible after a conversation like that, from my understanding, the proctor of that discussion was usually just completely inundated with their own issues that they demonstrably showed they couldn't care. It's not that they didn't care. And this is where I think a nuanced conversation is to be had. It's not that these folks are arrogant or are mean people and mean-spirited, but I believe they are truly hurting so much and they're afraid of sharing. And so out of that fear, they keep themselves compartmentalized and isolated. And, there's not a lot of self-disclosure. There's self-denial within themselves, self-medication. And they don't understand, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but they can't objectively understand that they're coming across like they're closed off. And Brene Brown talks about this. I believe it's Brene Brown. If you close the aperture in your life from the negative stuff, the positive stuff also dwindles down. So if you don't feel the lows, you also can't feel the highs. And so the more people trend down and self-medicate, they can't feel, and they can't afford to feel because they don't have the energy units, emotionally speaking, to transact feelings, right?
Yeah, Brene will talk about, these are the kinds of ways that you fuel connection, and what you've essentially done is cut it off by closing that.
Yes, yeah. And soldiers will feel that, right? The men and women of my platoon would feel when I'm not there. They'd feel when, just like, we're kids and we feel when our parents aren't paying attention to us. I think that's why it's so phenomenal for people to study psychology of children, because we were all once kids. And so we remember what it feels to be invalidated, to be hurt, to be not. And professionally speaking, how many times are people just acting out their childhood issues
my
managers,
dad always said to me that we just become older, we just get older. And so we still carry our baggage if we haven't worked it out and we haven't worked through it and worked with others. And so it sounds like one of the things that got overlooked also is that you're asking individuals who are hurting to go check on individuals who are hurting. And so how can they possibly be able to support and care for those? I mean, it's like almost asking someone, if you were to put this in the physical realm of like someone with two broken legs to go help somebody up the stairs. What did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed as a result of this experience?
Well, one thing that really stands out is when you're somebody who is willing to listen, I mean, that relationship grows tremendously, right? The depth of that, because once you allow for certain things to be dialogued about, I don't even know if I'm saying that correctly, but once you open that door, people will trust you and they'll come to you with these things. And it's amazing. It feels great, but then you there's weight to it, right? Because then you feel you owe them that listening ear, and it gets heavy quickly. But wow, I'm just thinking about one individual who, he shared with me stuff that he's never told a therapist before about war, in the Middle East. He's told me things that his wife didn't know, his kids don't know. And he said, hey, I want to disclose to you some stuff that I've never been able to share with anyone. And it's an honor to do that for someone who's a combat veteran, but it's dangerous as well, because then I could hear things that I don't want to hear. And then also,
but if you've opened it up to say, I want to talk to you, right? I'm here for you, to go back to our previous conversation in segment 1, by saying to someone genuinely, if you want to talk, I'm here for you, then you have opened it up to say that I'm willing to carry that load. Because other than checking off a box to say, did I ask them if they're okay? Yes, they said they were okay, then I moved on. If you're genuinely asking someone to be, that you're there for them, then you're saying I'm willing to carry that load. And I think that context matters, because if you said that this individual in particular didn't talk to their therapist about this situation, or their spouse or their kids, it's because they didn't believe that they would understand. And you, having been a soldier and currently continuing to serve our country, presents the opportunity to say that I actually will understand, or I will strive to understand. I'm in a better position to understand.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And so I had led with some issues that I was struggling with and working through, and some of the logic of what was going on through my mind about what I experienced. And he picked up on that right away. I was like, wait a minute, that resonates with something I experienced and I haven't talked about it. So let's talk about it. Cause he's naturally curious about learning more about a situation that hasn't been in his mind in a long time. And so it was really cool to almost forensically go back and piece it together, but then it comes the hangover, right, from sharing. So there was flashbacks that he had, and I think it was about 3 days of just intense, vivid dreams. And he felt like he had the flu for 3 days because he was just so much came up, it's a big process, and this is why I don't blame anybody for self-medicating. I don't. I'm not supporting it, but what I'm saying is, what else could some people do, right? I did that myself. Like, it's something when we're trying to survive something that was devastating to us, our brain's going to look for any way out of it. And so recovery and being intentional about this it's so exhausting, and there's so much that goes into it. It's extremely rewarding, but it comes at a price. And I just want to validate that if anybody, feels that they're struggling with sharing something to someone and finding a trusted companion, it's a big process.
Yeah. What frustrated you in this incident?
What frustrated me was that somebody who was, say, suicidal could tell somebody else who's suicidal, don't try to get help. Don't work on this. And it's out of their own suicidality and depression, struggle with life, that they would tell somebody else, because essentially I don't have the ability to fix myself. I'm not going to allow you to have the ability to fix yourself. It's a perpetuating cycle of despair. And, I don't want either party to hurt, but I certainly don't want them to augment one another's hurt. That's what was interesting about the situation. It wasn't, it was like almost like an exponential increase of pain, because two people who were hurting were kind of just, it was messy, So aiding both of them was important. Both parties.
In systems thinking, I was thinking of this, like, these sort of cycles, right? So it's like cause and effect cycles of I'm in pain. I tell you not to do anything about it. That produces more pain, right? Which produces more denial, which produces more, sort of like this self-perpetuating sort of you in this situation appear to have been the person to sort of intervene to disrupt that cycle, to provide that support for someone who is in deep need of an intervention, clearly.
Yeah, it definitely caused some tension. I'll tell you what.
I have no doubt. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Maybe don't share this episode with them. So in the in the end, though, one of the things that we like to think about when we do an after action review, which is deeply rooted in what has come from the military in terms of the power of reflecting back on an experience to somewhat reveal new learnings, as well as to affirm some decisions, and as well as to question so that we make better decisions in the future. So one of the things that we ask at the end is, what was something that was good that came out of the situation? And I anticipate that there is some good that came out of this.
Definitely. There were some real talks, real conversations about psychology, about emotional well-being. I've been out of the military for over a year, and I still get calls about issues that the soldiers were having. And just got a call last week about a soldier who we didn't know if he was alive or not. He was struggling with alcohol, and I've struggled with alcohol in the past. And so it was, again, an honor to receive a call as if I'm still relevant to these soldiers. And it's it always hurts me to hear about somebody who's hurting, but I think that, I'm quick to share that, and I want to be authentic. Having almost lost a soldier to suicide, my platoon, I hope, knew that I was ready and willing to have these conversations at the drop of a hat, rather than wait for something to blow up, to turn into a devastating life and death situation. And so it did allow me to be a resource to them and somebody who they would reach out to. And I'm honored by that. And it inspired me to write a book, to be honest. These soldiers inspired me to write this book, to share their story, because a lot of them don't want to talk about what they've gone through. They don't want the limelight. They don't want anyone to know who they are, but they gave me permission to talk about some things. And yeah, it's just, it's helping me help others feel less alone. I hope that's the main goal here.
My guest today was Dan Joseph, an Army veteran and the author of Backpack to Rucksack, Insight into Leadership and Resilience from Military Experts. And Dan, thank you so much for being on the program, and thank you for reminding us of the role of empathy and compassion and kindness, and more than anything, the importance of self-reflection and the real experiences of our friends and our neighbors who really need us to listen and intervene. And so thank you so much for being willing to be on the program and to help all of us recognize how important it is to really talk and listen. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print-inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader. I'm Peter Stiepelman. Please join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? It's kind of a silly question because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools.